I had never intended to stop. I was just trying to get home. But as the storm raged on, the highway turned into a blur of gray, and my windshield wipers couldn't keep up with the downpour. The night seemed endless, stretching before me like a black abyss. That's when I saw it. A flickering neon sign in the distance, its outline barely visible through the sheets of rain. I wasn't expecting much. Just a place to stretch my legs, grab a drink, and wait for the storm to pass. The sign read the Dead Man's Pub. A strange name, but then again, the strangest things seem normal when you've been driving for hours with nothing but your thoughts for company. As I pulled into the gravel parking lot, I noticed that the place wasn't exactly crowded. A single car sat under the awning, its headlights casting long shadows across the lot. The storm was still ferocious, and I was grateful for the shelter. I didn't even bother looking at the time. It didn't matter anymore. All I wanted was a moment of peace. I stepped inside, and the door creaked ominously behind me. The smell of stale beer and tobacco hit me instantly, mingling with the wet, earthy scent from outside. The air was thick, almost suffocating. The low murmur of voices stopped as I entered, and for a moment, I thought I might have made a mistake. But the bartender was quick to smile and wave me over. "Rain's a bit much, huh?" he said, wiping his hands on a rag and gesturing for me to sit. I nodded and took a seat at the bar. The bartender looked tired, his face weathered and pale, like he hadn't seen daylight in years. His hair was disheveled, and his eyes, though kind, held an unsettling depth, as if he knew things I didn't. "What can I get you?" he asked. "A whiskey." "Neat." He nodded and poured the drink with a practiced hand, sliding it across the counter. There was a strange click when the glass hit the wood, as if the bar itself had been waiting for this moment. I took a sip. The whiskey burned, but in a good way, like it was cleaning out the dust and cobwebs of my mind. For a moment, the storm outside seemed distant, a mere memory. "You traveling through?" the bartender asked. "Yeah," I said, not wanting to go into details. I didn't have an explanation for why I'd ended up in this remote part of nowhere. "You'll want to be careful around here," he warned, his voice lowering. "Things have a way of changing. The weather, the people, everything." I stared at him, unsure if he was speaking metaphorically or if I had stumbled into something strange. I didn't want to know, but something told me I was about to find out. "I'll be fine," I said, offering a half-hearted smile. The room felt oddly quiet. I glanced around, noticing the patrons now. There were only a few, a man in a wide-brimmed hat at the far end of the bar, his face obscured by shadows, an elderly woman sitting alone at a table near the corner, her eyes locked on a cigarette burning in an ashtray, and a couple in a booth, their heads bent together as they whispered furiously, but the words were lost in the murmur of the storm. My attention was drawn back to the jukebox in the corner. It was an old thing, the kind that seemed to belong to another era, and it had a strange, unsettling hum about it. The song that played wasn't one I recognized. It was a slow, eerie melody, like the kind you'd hear in a forgotten film noir. The notes seemed to drag, stretching longer than they should, making the room feel even heavier. "That song's a bit unsettling, don't you think?" I asked, trying to break the oppressive silence. The bartender smiled again, but it was thin and tight, like he was holding something back. "It's the song of this place," he said softly. "Once it starts, it never stops." I felt a chill creep down my spine. I didn't ask what he meant by that. The whiskey was starting to kick in, and my thoughts were beginning to feel foggy, disjointed. I turned back to the bar, trying to focus, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. I was about to take another sip when I heard a soft voice, faint but clear. "Leave now. Don't stay." I froze. The voice was coming from the booth, from the couple. They were no longer whispering. The woman was staring directly at me, her eyes wide, pleading. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "You don't understand. This place doesn't let people go." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the bartender spoke again, his tone suddenly sharp. "That's enough, Mary," he said, his eyes narrowing. The woman in the booth shrank back, her face pale. She quickly turned her attention to her partner, who had grown unnaturally still, his hands folded in his lap. I glanced at the bartender, but his expression had softened again, like nothing had happened. "Ignore her," he said. "Some people, well, they get a little too attached to this place. It doesn't do them any good." My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a sudden urge to leave, to get back in my car and drive until I didn't remember the name of this place. But my body wouldn't cooperate. It was like something was holding me there, pulling me back into the bar, into the conversation I wasn't supposed to have. I stared at the woman, at the despair written across her face, and something in me snapped. What do you mean? What's going on here? Her eyes flickered to the bartender, and for a moment, they were full of terror. But then she leaned forward, her voice a whisper, barely audible over the hum of the jukebox. We're stuck, she said. This place, it never lets anyone leave. The storm's just an excuse. The real thing is worse. When you sit here, when you drink that whiskey, her voice trailed off, and she shuddered. It gets into you. It takes you. It's not just the storm. It's this place. It feeds on you. The air grew colder. The jukebox stopped, its eerie hum cutting off mid-song, and the room fell silent. The patrons, all of them, turned their eyes to me, their faces blank, expressionless. I've seen it happen, the woman continued, her voice trembling. People come here. They drink. And then they disappear. They're never the same when they leave. I didn't know what to make of her words. I didn't want to believe them. But I couldn't ignore the way the room felt, the way the air was charged with something unnatural. My hand was trembling as I reached for my glass, but as I did, I noticed the bartender's eyes on me. They were cold now, calculating. You're not leaving, he said quietly, almost a command. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words died in my throat. Something was closing in on me, something in the very fabric of this place. I could feel it, creeping under my skin. Before I could move, the woman stood, her face now desperate. You have to go, she shouted, but it was too late. The lights flickered once, then went out entirely, plunging the room into darkness. In that moment, I knew something was terribly wrong. The storm outside roared louder, but the wind that howled through the bar was colder than any storm. I could feel hands, cold and visible, reaching for me, pulling me into something deeper, darker. And then, before I could take another breath, I heard the door slam open. The sound was sharp, deafening. The air grew still, but the atmosphere was no less suffocating. The bartender stood up straight, his eyes never leaving me. You're staying, he said, his voice like ice. I tried to scream, to run, but my body betrayed me. The room spun, and the faces around me melted, merging into something worse. I never left the dead man's pub, and neither did the others who came before me. We're all just part of the song now, a melody that will never end. I never liked small-town bars. They always felt like liminal spaces, caught between the mundane and the surreal. But when you're driving through miles of desolate countryside, with a storm bearing down on you, you don't have much choice. That's how I found myself at the Hollow Lantern. The neon sign buzzed and flickered weakly, its orange glow casting strange shadows on the gravel parking lot. It was the only beacon in the middle of a stretch of empty road that seemed to go on forever. My phone had lost signal hours ago, and the gas gauge was flirting with empty. I told myself I'd grab a drink, use their landline to call for directions, and be back on the road in no time. The bar was dimly lit, a haze of smoke clinging to the air like it was afraid to leave. A jukebox in the corner played an old blues tune, scratchy and distorted, as if it were coming from another world. A few patrons sat scattered across the room, their faces obscured by shadows. They didn't look up when I walked in. The bartender, a wiry man with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes, greeted me with a nod. His smile was tight, forced, like he was trying to remember how. "What'll it be?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Whiskey." "Neat," I said, taking a seat at the bar. The stool wobbled under my weight, the kind of instability that made you question how many people had sat there before you and why they'd left. He poured the drink and slid it across the counter without a word. The glass was chipped, the kind of detail that seemed insignificant but stuck with you. I took a sip, the liquor burning its way down my throat. It was stronger than I expected, almost medicinal, but I didn't complain. "Quiet night," I said, trying to make conversation. The bartender chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "It's always quiet here. Until it's not." I frowned, unsure if he was joking or trying to unsettle me. Either way, I didn't press further. I turned my attention to the room, observing the other patrons. A man in a cowboy hat nursed a beer at a corner table, his eyes fixed on the same spot on the wall. A woman with wild, unkempt hair sat by the jukebox, her fingers twitching in time with the music. Two men in matching flannel shirts played pool, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were underwater. Something about the atmosphere felt off. It wasn't just the outdated decor or the strange patrons. It was the way the air seemed heavy, oppressive, like the room itself was alive and watching me. I finished my drink and signaled for another. The bartender obliged, but this time, as he handed me the glass, his hand lingered on mine for just a moment too long. His touch was cold, almost clammy. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "No," I admitted. "Just passing through. Got caught in the storm." He nodded slowly, as if he already knew. "Be careful. Roads around here have a way of swallowing people." I forced a laugh. "Thanks for the warning." As I took another sip, I noticed something strange. The jukebox, which had been playing that same scratchy blues tune since I arrived, seemed to loop back on itself. The song never ended, just repeated the same verse over and over. The woman sitting next to it didn't seem to mind. She was humming along, her voice discordant and jarring. I checked my watch. It was stuck, the second hand twitching back and forth in the same spot. I tapped the glass, but it didn't budge. "You all right?" the bartender asked, his voice tinged with something that sounded like amusement. "Yeah," I said, though I didn't believe it. "Just tired." "You should rest," he said. "Storm's not letting up anytime soon." I glanced out the window. The rain was coming down in sheets, the wind howling like a wounded animal. He was right, there was no way I'd make it far in that weather. Still, something about this place made me want to leave, storm be damned. "Do you have a phone I can use?" I asked. His smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No phones here." "Seriously? Not even a payphone?" He shook his head. "We like to keep things simple." I was about to argue when the jukebox suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Every head in the room turned to look at me. Their faces were wrong. Too pale, their features slightly distorted, like reflections in a cracked mirror. "What the hell is this?" I muttered, standing up. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in around me. My heart raced, the air growing thicker with each breath. "You should sit down," the bartender said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "You're not ready to leave yet." I stumbled toward the door, ignoring him. My legs felt heavy, like they were sinking into the floor. When I reached the handle, it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, panic rising in my chest. "You can't leave," the woman by the jukebox said. Her voice was layered, like multiple people speaking at once. "Not until it's done." "What's done?" I shouted, spinning around. The patrons were standing now, their bodies unnaturally still, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The bartender stepped forward, his smile now impossibly wide. "You came to the Hollow Lantern. That means you owe us something." "I don't owe you anything," I yelled, backing away. My hands searched for something, anything, I could use as a weapon. "Oh, but you do," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Everyone who comes here does." The room began to shift, the walls melting and reforming into strange, jagged shapes. The patrons moved closer, their distorted faces becoming clearer. They weren't human, not anymore. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes, hands grabbing me, voices whispering things I couldn't understand, the bartender's laughter echoing in my ears. When I woke up, I was lying on the side of the road, my car nowhere in sight. The bar was gone, replaced by an empty field. I don't know how long I sat there, trying to piece together what happened. Eventually, a truck driver found me and gave me a ride to the nearest town. I didn't tell him about the bar. I didn't tell anyone. But sometimes late at night, I hear that same scratchy blues tune in the back of my mind, looping endlessly. And I know the Hollow Lantern is still out there, waiting for its next visitor. It was nearing midnight when the storm forced me off the highway. The rain hammered relentlessly, my wipers failing to keep up, and the beams of my headlights barely cut through the downpour. My plan had been to drive straight through the night, but nature had other ideas. That's when I saw the sign. Its letters glowed faintly, flickering in the distance like a beacon, the Midnight Tavern. Beneath it, a small wooden building with a porch light that swayed in the howling wind. It wasn't on the map, and I hadn't seen a gas station or motel for miles. But I didn't have the luxury of being picky. I parked, stepping out into the cold rain. Gravel crunched underfoot as I hurried to the door, my coat offering little protection. When I opened it, the warm glow of dim light and the low murmur of voices greeted me. It felt like stepping into another world, away from the chaos outside. The bar was cozy, if a little dated. Wooden beams stretched overhead, and the walls were lined with faded photographs and signs advertising long-defunct brands of beer. The air smelled of smoke, old leather, and something faintly metallic. A jukebox in the corner played a slow, haunting tune. one I didn't recognize. The bartender looked up as I approached. He was an older man with graying hair slicked back and a face that seemed etched with the weight of years. His eyes, though, were sharp and piercing, watching me as if I were an anomaly. "Welcome," he said, his voice gravelly. "What brings you out in this weather?" "Storm caught me," I replied, shaking water off my coat. "Thought I'd wait it out here." He nodded, pulling a glass from beneath the counter. "Whiskey?" "Sure," I said. The drink was poured without a word, and I took a seat at the bar. The whiskey burned in the best way, warming me from the inside out. For a moment, I let myself relax. There were a few other patrons scattered about. A man in a dark trench coat sat at the far end of the bar, nursing a drink and staring into space. A woman in a red dress lounged in a booth, swirling her glass lazily. At a corner table, 3 men played cards, their faces obscured by shadows. It all felt strangely timeless, like the kind of place that existed outside the flow of the world. The bartender broke the silence. "Where you headed?" "Home," I said, though that word felt distant to me in the moment. "Got a ways to go still." He smiled faintly, but there was something unsettling about it. "People pass through here all the time," he said. "But not many leave." I chuckled, assuming he was joking. "Yeah, storms like this can trap you for a while." He didn't laugh. Instead, he reached for a bottle and refilled my glass. "You ever hear the stories about this place?" he asked. I shook my head. "They say the Midnight Tavern isn't a place you find. It's a place that finds you." I frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" He shrugged, his smile faint. "Just something people say." I turned my attention back to the room. The woman in the red dress was now staring at me, her expression unreadable. Her drink sat untouched, and for a moment, I thought she was about to say something. But when I blinked, she was looking away again, her fingers idly tapping the table. The jukebox shifted to a new song, one with a strange, lilting melody that seemed almost too slow. It filled the room like a fog, making everything feel heavier. "What's the deal with the jukebox?" I asked. "Plays what it wants," the bartender said with a shrug. I laughed uneasily, unsure if he was serious. Time passed, or at least it felt like it did. The whiskey went down smooth, and the warmth of the room made it easy to forget the storm outside. But the longer I stayed, the more I noticed things. The man in the trench coat hadn't moved. His glass was still half full, and his posture remained identical to when I'd first seen him. The card players in the corner were silent, their game seeming to stretch endlessly, none of them winning or losing. And the woman in red, she was gone. I hadn't seen her leave, but her booth was empty now, the glass she'd been holding still on the table. I glanced at the bartender. "Where'd she go?" He followed my gaze, but said nothing. Something about the silence unnerved me. I drained my glass and stood, reaching for my coat. "Thanks for the drink," I said. "Leaving already?" the bartender asked, his tone neutral but somehow weighted. "Yeah, I should get back on the road." He nodded slowly. "Suit yourself. But be careful out there." The door felt heavier than when I'd entered, and the cold air hit me like a slap. I hurried to my car, eager to put distance between myself and the strange little bar. But when I turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. "Come on," I muttered, trying again. Nothing. I sat back in frustration, the rain pounding against the roof. My phone had no signal, of course. I was about to head back inside when I noticed something odd. The building was gone. The parking lot was empty. No sign of the tavern, no sign of the neon sign that had lured me in. Just the gravel beneath my tires and the endless expanse of rain. I stepped out of the car, spinning in place. The storm swallowed everything, erasing the horizon. My heart raced. And then I heard it, the faint, haunting melody of the jukebox. It drifted through the air, impossible to locate, but unmistakable. I got back into the car, locking the doors out of some primal instinct. The melody grew louder, filling the cabin, though there was no source. I don't know how long I sat there, waiting for something to happen. When the storm finally broke, the road was dry, and the night was silent. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't left the Midnight Tavern. I still hear the music sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, and I wonder if I ever really left at all.